All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Living the Dream podcast. Today on the show, we have Charlie Sheldon, who has had many different careers, but is a writer now. We're gonna get to hear a little bit about him, his dreams, his goals, and how we can help. So, Charlie, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and thanks for having me on.
Of course, Charlie. Thanks for being on. Thanks for being on. And we like to jump right in. So, if you could start with just telling us a little bit about yourself and some of the things that you like to do for fun, that would be great.
Okay, about myself. Uh, I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S., and all my life I've liked backpacking and camping and hiking. And most of my work life has been around the water as either a fisherman or working for ports or as a merchant sailor. But I kept doing the things I like to do, and I've retired from that work now and trying to make it sell some books as a writer, but I'm still doing the same things for fun, which is basically getting outdoors whenever I can.
I love that. I love that. The outdoors is such a peaceful thing to go do.
It's
So
true.
I like that a lot. Tell us about your motivation in life. What gets you up and keeps you going every day?
Uh, Generally speaking, some kind of challenge, I guess you'd say. This I'm most like many people, including I think like my wife actually. If you have something in front of you as kind of a project to do that focuses you and gives you energy, and you have a task to accomplish. I'm not very good at multitasking, right? It's sort of one thing at a time. Generally, you try to chase what you're interested in, I think. And though the periods during my life when I've been least happy or most bland, I guess you'd say, it's when I've not had something specific that I'm trying to develop or learn or do well at. Just tooling along day to day doesn't do very well for me.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And tell us a little bit more about that. How do you go from kind of that tootling around from day to day to really having a purpose driven project that you're working on?
I think it's a matter of interest. I don't know about you, but I've talked to other people who've gone to sea, for example. And I think whether it's in our training or how we're wired, different people are interested in different things, right? So you can be walking down the street and something would really strike your interest, almost like a bolt of pure energy. Oh man, I want to do that, or I want to learn about that, or I want to see that. And it's not the same for everybody. I mean, different people have very different interests. And if you're lucky, as many people are, you'll find out what those interests are early enough to really explore them and I think develop them. You know, I think it's constrained because we all very soon have to earn a living, right? And then when you're doing that, you're often in a position where you're not really thrilled to do it, but you do what you have to do. And there's a lot of that. And that's the way life is. And then you have to find an interest that fits in within whatever burden of what your work is just to make your life tolerable. But and so so I've always had passion interest in a few in a few things, and they usually last really intensely for about 5 to 10 years, and then they might fade a little bit. But over time, and I've been around a while now, certain things remain consistent year to year and decade to decade. And I think you're at your peril if you don't try to feed that and follow that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, what would you say to the person who's sitting out there and doesn't have any interests?
Well, I doubt that people don't have any interests, but I just say, look, try to find, I mean, follow, try to find something that you're curious about. Um, I think I think that's the key, and sometimes you have to step outside of your comfortable box to do that or see that. I mean, I knew a guy who was a Japanese. He was Japanese actually. He was had been a fisherman in Japan, but he grew up in the inland of Japan. He never saw the ocean. He never heard about the ocean. He told me that the first time he saw the ocean, when he was about 15 years old, he knew in an instant that's where he was going. Or some people I've known from the time I was a little kid that I wanted to write novels. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm very successful at it, but I do it, right? And it's almost like a curse. You have to do it because you're driven to do it. But in the process of doing it, sometimes other interests will come forth, you know. So I'm not, I haven't, when you reach a certain point in life, the steps you've taken, the tracks you've put down define pretty much who you are, you know. And if you're lucky, you're not displeased with the path you've taken. And if you're unlucky, you're troubled because you feel you didn't quite go the way you wanted to, whatever that means. I don't think that has to do with necessarily career success or money so much as just being comfortable with yourself and what you've chosen to chase and develop, you know. And if for those people who don't have interest in anything, I don't know what to suggest. I think the only thing I'd suggest is make a complete and utter change in your circumstance or where you're standing, because if you're not getting it where you are, you may not get it.
Yeah. And I love that you said make a complete change, because really what I meant by having no interest is that kind of having your interests be silenced by your environment and what you're doing every day. Because, you know, if you don't have the time or room to think about some of your passions because you're so busy living other people's lives, you might think of yourself as somebody with no interests.
That's true. I do think today, and this is maybe not politically correct, but I think for many, many, many people, they don't see any option to the position they're in, either because they're in debt or because they've got a crummy job, but they don't know where else to go, or they can't find work, or they can't get health insurance. And so for people who are really struggling day to day just to put food on the table, their flexibility to start again is very limited. I mean, let's be realistic. They have to find some value or beauty or reinforcement right where they are somehow. And that's a challenge for people. Other people who have more freedom, either because they have no responsibilities or they have lots of resources so they can choose to do something. If it doesn't work out, they can come back. You know, it's a little different for them. But I think for many people, it's such a rat race today that I think people just, you know, you're just down the trenches going day to day. I know when I was younger and my kids were little, and one of my kids now has little kids of his own. When your kids are 6 and 3 or 8 and 10, you're in the trenches. You know, you don't have a second. You know, you got this to do, that to do, this to do, that today. You know, watching the kids and trying to work and you blink and 10 years are gone by. That's kind of what happens. You know, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just the way it is. But in those moments you do have, if you can feed some of whatever your interest is, I think it's healthier mentally. And I'm lucky because some of my interests are reasonably economical. You know, going out and walking in the woods is not very expensive, which is good. I mean, if I liked flying airplanes, it would be more of a challenge because airplanes are expensive to fly. So
Yeah.
you know, it's just a trade-off, and you just hope for the best, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I love that. I love that. Well, tell us a little bit about your book that you just released.
My book there's 3 books I've written. It's a series of books called the Strong Heart Trilogy. It's fiction set in the Pacific Northwest about an ornery young girl who fetches up with a grandfather she never knew she had. He never knew he had a granddaughter. She knew she had a grandfather. And he takes her hiking and they have a great adventure. And it's 3 books. They're separate books, but they're all set in the Northwest, all about coming of age and wisdom and ancient truth and ancient legends. And it's really a celebration of people who are out in the wilderness or at sea. And they're fiction. And it's easy to find them. They're in bookstores. They're on Amazon. You can find them. And I think people would enjoy them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Tell us about your reason for writing the book. Is it just you want to be a writer, or do you have kind of a vision and goal for this book?
I I've written 8 or 9 novels now, and the first few of them were very simple capers just to finish the book. You know, you start a novel, you want to finish it. right? But the last series, and then of course, because I had to work as a day job all these years, I mean, I wouldn't write for a number of years, and then I'd write again when I had time. But by the way, when you're doing a day job that involves working in an office, writing memos back and forth to people, that's the worst curse on a writer there is writing bureaucratic memos to people. So it's hard to do both. But I had this idea about wanting to do a story about the Pacific Northwest, and specifically about a legend that all the native people out here have always had, which is that they've always been here, that they didn't come over here on the land bridge. They've always been here. And I wanted to play with that. I wanted to be part of a story in a sense, somehow this mystery with asking the question, could some of the old legends that we all hear about actually have some truth to them? But really, in the end, when you write a story, I want you, the reader, to fall into the story. It's not about making a point or giving you a lesson or explaining anything. It's about going with the story, just being lost in the story. And if you learn a few things along the way, great. But mainly, it's to enjoy the story. And I've had some luck with that, and it's been enjoyable that way. So, and I was driven to do it. This is not something that I thought about this for years and years and years, and finally started really doing research on it about 11 years ago. And so it's taken me 10 or 11 years to do this. Persistence is important.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So take us back to your first novel. What really caused you to take the first step and be like, I'm going to finish this after all that time?
Well, I tried writing a novel in my 20s and realized I hadn't lived enough to write about anything. I just didn't know enough. And then I did a lot of writing, but it was more trade industry writing in the fishing industry for newspapers and stuff, because I was in that industry. And then the motivation for the first novel was not a good motivation. Another guy I didn't know had written a novel about the fishing industry that I thought was a terrible novel. And I thought, I can do better than that. And that was my motivation. Now, that's a bad motivation for a book, but that's sort of how I started. And it wasn't a novel about the fishing industry. It was a caper set in New York. And I started it writing longhand, commuting on the train back and forth to the World Trade Center where I was working at the time, right? Half an hour each way. And it's amazing. In 4 months, you can have a draft of a book if you do a little bit every day.
Oh, yeah.
I'm basically lazy. If somebody told me write a 50,000 word book, I couldn't do it because it's too much. But if you write 300 words a day, it adds up,
It does.
And I finished it, and it was just a caper. And I knew another guy who had some books published, and he said, send your book to my agent. And I did, and she took me, which I now know was a near miracle, but she did. And then she got it published. And then we had a falling out because I didn't want to write a series at that point. And she thought, well, you sold this book, you can still do a series with these guys. I said, I don't want to do that. And so she said, well, good luck. So I wrote about something else, and I wrote about something else. You know what? Nothing happened.
Yeah.
So, none of this is easy. The sometimes I think if you're going to stand up in a lecture hall and talk about what you go through to try to promote a book, it's like a 7-hour lecture on all the agony and humiliation and rejection that you go through. It's unrelenting. It's unbelievable. So you have to be driven to it. I mean, why else? I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, awesome, Charlie. If there was one or two people or types of people that you could meet right now to really help you continue on your journey as a writer, who would they be and how would they do it?
That's a great question. I guess one of the people would be, and this is a purely selfish thing, is if I met someone, luck has a huge amount to do with being seen as a writer, because these days there's so many books produced. 70,000 books a year. So how do you even get seen? And so if someone who had a big following, an influencer, someone, I wouldn't say this, but someone like Oprah Winfrey, right, who has, she said, if your book's seen in the hand of somebody like that, everybody's going to get it, right? So that's a very selfish motivation. I guess the other thing I'd say is, and I've been lucky this way, I've met a couple of people who are older writers who've been there and done it, and it's always good to talk to them for perspective and humility, in terms of what to expect and so on. And in the end, it's most of the time, and most of your hours are spent producing the book, watching the story happen. And that's very rewarding. You're in a creative zone, you're watching a story happen. It's very energetic. The system of promotion and marketing it is a very different part of your brain, very different set of skills. I don't have them. so any little help I can get. So at this point in my life anyway, at this point, I'm not going to change. I am who I am, and I've done what I've done, and that's okay. And I'm happy that I got the series finished. It's as good as I could make it, and if people want to read it, great. And if they don't want to read it, okay, that's okay too. At least I finished it.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. I love that. What's the most important one or two things that everyday people can do to help you continue on your journey as a writer?
Everyday people, they can read, if they're in the Pacific Northwest, they can read the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association holiday catalog, which has a big ad for my books in it. I mean, that's the selfish thing, I'm like, when I was 16 years old, I bicycled around the Gaspé Peninsula up in Quebec with 2 other kids. I can't believe my parents let me do it, but they did. And we did. It was 600 miles. And when we were bicycling around the peninsula, I noticed all along the road, there'd be these tables with kids sitting behind the tables with little meat pies on the tables. And people who drive by would see the table and they'd stop and look at the pie and maybe buy the pie. And I think I'm like the little kid sitting by the road of the table. My books are like the meat pies sitting on the table. All I want people to do is stop and take a look. If they don't take them, fine, but at least look at them.
Yeah,
that's what I want.
I feel that. Stop and take a look. Well, awesome. This might be a really, really tough question for you. We're going to jump into our Thriving 3 now.
Thriving 3? Okay.
I get to hear about how you thrive in your life and just the stuff that you do every day. And so, what is your favorite book, movie, or podcast? Pick one.
I'd pick book, my favorite book. And I think my favorite book, I think, is The Lord of the Rings, which is books, but that's my favorite book.
We get some, I do this podcast a decent amount, and Oprah has been on it probably 6, 7, 8 times now, and Lord of the Rings has been on it a decent chunk of times. It's just always cool to hear people's answers. But yeah, Lord of the Rings, great series. Maybe I should read it because I haven't.
Well, the first time I read it, it was many, many years ago. I was a freshman in college, and I discovered there's really 4 books, because the first book's called The Hobbit, and then there's the trilogy. And I read The Hobbit and fell into The Hobbit and read it in about a day and a half. And then I heard there were 3 more books, and I got those 3 books, and I disappeared in my room until I finished them. I mean, I was gone, and I've read it 3 or 4 times since, and now I criticize little parts of it, but it's a great story. And I think the reason I named the story was that here's a guy who had to let this fantasy come out of his brain, and it worked, and that's just, to me, a miracle. So yeah, that's the one I'd pick.
Love it. And what's one way you like to take care of yourself?
2 things. I like to row for exercise. I have a little rowboat I use out here in Puget Sound that I go out in when I can. And I like to hike in the mountains. and that works for me.
Gotcha. And what's one action step you can take right now or continue to take if you're already doing it to keep on being the writer you want to become?
Start the next series, which I had to delay because of this promotion for this third book. And I'm just getting about ready to get back into it and looking forward to it.
Gotcha.
And I think that's the key about all of this is to be either you have to be learning something new or creating something new to stay healthy and alive in a way. You know, if you end up just sitting on what you've done or reviewing what you've done, I think that's dangerous myself. No.
Yeah, for sure. Do we get a little sneak peek into the next series?
Well, the only thing I'd say is I'm toying with the idea of this series finishes today. It's set. I'm thinking of doing another series set about 100 years in the future, dealing with exoplanets and extraterrestrial life and time travel, and kind of with a link back to the first series in an interesting way, in that the protagonist in my first series, who's 14 in my books now, would then be a great grandmother of 109, and her great grandchildren would have some great adventure too. So that's what I'm toying with.
I love that. Well, awesome. Um, that's all we really got for you. I guess my question is, have you ever thought about starting a podcast for writers?
You know, I have, but I'll tell you why I'm not doing it. I mean, I have thought of it. I have a little webpage blog, charliesheldon2.com is what it is. And it's hard enough to feed the blog. You know, I mean, it becomes you have this obligation to keep your content fresh and steadied. And I've been doing a number of podcasts in a way that, in hopes that some of your listeners might be interested in these stories just by chance. And I've learned from, I couldn't do what you guys do. I mean, you guys talk about having to produce over time. I don't think I could do it. So I admire you for doing it. I really admire you doing it, but I don't think, if I did that, I'd have to give up everything else. I guess I'm saying, you know, I think to do one right, you need to spend a lot of time. That's my sense. I mean, I haven't done one, but just from listening to what you guys say and watching, it's, you know, you have to have ideas, you have to have guests, you have to have ways of getting it. It's a lot of work, right?
It's a decent amount of work. Yes, it is.
How long have you been doing this?
So I started it in March,
you just started.
But I was really sporadic there, like really sporadic. Like I'd post a couple episodes and I'd stop, then I'd post a couple, then I'd stop, then I'd post a couple. And now I'm really like honing in on it because talking to people about their dreams and goals is my passion.
Right.
So honing in on the podcast, scaling it to daily. Now I do 2 to 3 interviews a day, really, except for Saturdays. And come like mid to late December, I'll be posting daily on this podcast. And so your episode will be posted sometime in mid to late January. And
do you have, I mean, has your listenership been going up as you've been doing this? I mean, can you have a way of tracking that?
Yep, there is a way to track it. So I post through anchor.fm and they track all the numbers for me. They'll track like who listens on Spotify, who listens on Apple. I also post on YouTube, the video portion of it. But my listenership hasn't gone up as of yet because I haven't started posting daily yet. But I'm assuming like 90 days into daily, 120 days into daily, once I have 150, 180 episodes out, my listeners will start to increase steadily. I'll start to build that audience, and then it'll
That's great. That's great. Well, I always think, and I think of this even now at my ancient age, but my dad, one piece of advice my dad gave to me, which is right down your alley in terms of what you're talking about. He said to me, probably when I was 12 or 13 years old, he said to me, whatever you choose to do, if you have a choice, you know, whatever you choose to do, try to find something that you somewhat enjoy, because you're going to spend a lot of hours doing it. And he said to me, he said, I went to work in the wool industry in Massachusetts. He was in the textile industry in Massachusetts before World War II, and he hated it, but he had to work, right? And then the war came along, and it saved his life, because he was a soldier for a few years, and he came back and he went to school on a GI Bill and did what he really wanted to do, which was study animals, be a wildlife biologist. And so my family history is of we men, bang around because we don't know what to do, and you try to find something that you're like doing. And I know I've now worked enough to know that there have been periods in my life when I've done something I love doing. And there have been other just as long periods, maybe even longer, when I've had an idiot for a boss and it's been abusive and miserable. And, you just suck it up and do it because you have to. You have a family, you have kids, you do it. And you just try to survive and hope, that something will come along that can give you that little turn that makes it bearable or passable or even fun. And I've been lucky. I've had that happen a couple of times. And when I was despairing and thought it was all over, and then something came along, and when I finished I worked for almost 30 years for seaports, right? In New York and then Seattle and Bellingham, Washington. And I got to be a big shot, sort of, in these organizations. I'm not very good as a big shot, but I got to be a big shot. And you're dealing with elected commissioners, and it's very political, and I don't, anyway. But eventually I left. I was actually fired from the last job because I got crossways with one of the elected commissioners, and you can't do that, of course. And they fired me. But I was able, and I was 65, but what I was able to do, because I'd been a commercial fisherman years earlier, was I documented all my sea time from fishing. And then I joined the Sailors Union of the Pacific, which is merchant sailing on big ships like container ships and cargo ships. And I went back to sea for 4 years as a sailor, right? It was work. It wasn't very pleasant. I'm chipping rust and so on, but you can't spend any money. And you know what? I was able to write in between, the ships would come in and I'd do it. And my wife and I talked about it, and it was okay. We were okay. I'd be gone for periods of time. Everybody's different. You know what I mean? But some would say that was the stupidest thing I could have done. But I would say it was actually a very smart thing, because it carried me over until I was 70. And B, it became a great vehicle for putting these stories together. You know what I mean? And so you don't know. I guess, I'd say you don't know, but you have to keep your eyes peeled, I guess I would say. And again, back to my dad, find something that you like, find something that, if you can, something that you like. I don't think kids today, young kids, have as much flexibility necessarily because of college debt and other things. And the jobs aren't the same today. I think it's harder today, frankly. I think it's a lot harder. And in the old days, it used to be, if you were a restless young person and you couldn't fit in, you'd go out to the frontier and you'd cut down trees for the settlers, or you'd sail around the world on the whaling ship. You can't do that anymore. So now they're all here. What do they do? Anyway, life is complicated.
Yeah.
So you do the best you can.
Yeah.
I'm doing the best I can.
I love that. Well, awesome, Charlie. Thanks for being on the show. I think that's a great place to end it. And you said we could go contact you at your blog at charliesheldon2.com.
That's right. It's IE Charlie, IESheldon2.com. Or the books are Strongheart, Adrift, and Totem. And you could just look them up, go to a bookstore and ask for them. They may be in the bookstore, or they'll order it for you. So, but yeah, charliesheldon2.com would be a good way to start. That's summaries of the books and some other stuff about stories I've done you might find fun. So,
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, if you're listening to this podcast and you liked what Charlie had to say, you want to support him and get some of his books, go ahead and do that. Also, if you happen to know Oprah or any other very important influencer that can help Charlie out, let's connect them. And Charlie, you never know. I might be an influencer here in a year holding your book.
So. I'm sure you will. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay,
And
thanks.
Guys, thank you for listening to the show. Charlie, thank you for coming on. As always, send this episode to somebody you know who needs to hear it. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, and we're out.